you have decided to join us during our Holy Week 2026. We took the month of March off, but we are ready to get the series going back again, and we are focusing on decolonizing Christianity, decolonizing Christianity. And so we welcome you to our monthly Justice Dialogue session. And we have to lead us off in our series, our new series, a wonderful, incredible, and intelligent man of God. But as we do with every Justice Dialogues moment, we want to center all things that we do in the Word of God. And it says in the Gospel of Matthew, the 7th chapter, 21 through 23, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do mighty works in your name? Then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Go away from me. You behave lawlessly. My name is Brian Ellis Gibbs. My colleague is Minister Matthew Rivera, and we are national coordinators for the Healing and Transforming Unit of American Baptist Home Mission Societies. Our director is the Reverend Dr. Jennifer Stewart. And we are bringing you April of 2026, this Justice Dialogues. And just for those who may not be familiar, Justice Dialogues was launched in 2020 during the pandemic to help Christian citizens who work, live, and pray together realize a more just society. It also reflects ABHMS's deep commitment to faith-rooted social justice and its mission to bring healing and transformation across the United States and Puerto Rico. It is a convening of nationwide, multicultural, intergenerational audience of like-minded partners to experience allyship, spiritual support, and opportunities through the exchange of thoughts and perspectives. And so we look forward to our conversation today. And our speaker for today, who will help us and guide us in our dialogue for today, is Reverend Dr. Jeremy L. Williams. And Dr. Williams is a global thinker, award-winning teacher, and ordained preacher. He is a scholar of religion who is a graduate of Vanderbilt, Yale, and Harvard universities. He's the author of several publications, including Criminalization and Acts of the Apostles. He's the assistant professor of New Testament at Bright Divinity School in Texas, where he is also the inaugural director of the Center for Theology and Justice. He regularly teaches courses on biblical interpretation, Luke, Acts, Paul's letters, prison industrial complex, abolition, race, and justice. Reverend Williams has pastored small and large CME, for those who don't know, Christian Methodist Episcopal congregations across the United States. He is married to Kiara, with whom he shares the joy of teaching their three-year-old son how to journey life well and dream better and probably also bigger dreams. And so we are excited about what Dr. Williams will present to us and what God has given him to share with us. Just some tech tips. Unless you are speaking, always make sure that you are muted. Unless you are speaking, always make sure you are muted. And the time for our dialogue, we want you to use the button on the bottom of your screen where it says raise hand. Where the reaction buttons are, there's a raise hand button. So when we get to that point of conversation and you want to speak, please use the raise your hand button. And turn on your camera, especially if you're speaking, if you're comfortable. Please be reminded that this is recorded and will be published on our social media platform. That is the American Baptist Home Mission Society platform. And please, even now, you can begin to share in the chat where you are from, what your location is. We are here in King of Prussia, but I know there's folks from around the nation and Puerto Rico joining us today. And again, Remember to keep yourselves on mute unless you are speaking. Just want to make sure that we have create a culture and a room and a space of respect, of responsibility, taking responsibility, empathy, sensitivity, that we are thinking through what is being said before we speak, but that we engage in conversation and in dialogue with questions that Dr. Williams, I'm sure, will be able to help us parse through. And so, as we get ready, I want you all to put on your seatbelt because Justice Dialogues is ready to take off. We just want to present to you again Dr. Jeremy L. Williams from Bright Divinity School in Texas.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
All
sir.
right, good afternoon, good morning from where I am. Good day, guten tag. I'm excited to be here with you. It's good to see all of you here, and I see some friends I know in the chat. I'm excited for our time together. We're about to jump into some really heavy subjects, and especially when we talk about Jesus, we should walk trepidatiously. So I want to invite us to take a moment to do some deep breathing to center ourselves as we prepare to get into this today. So I invite you to breathe in deeply with gratitude for a new day. Exhale with anticipation of what you're going to learn. Inhale and feel the oxygen move and wiggle through your extremities and your fingers and toes. Exhale as your breath rejoins the community of spirits where you are and those of us together on this virtual space. Inhale one more time with anticipation of what you are getting ready to encounter and what we will learn from each other. And then exhale to remove anything that may be in your way. All right. I don't have much time to get us started. They told me 15 minutes. And as a professor, I speak in 75-minute increments at a time. So I'm going to have to pick it up like it's warm and drop it like it's hot. But I believe we have some really good things to get into today. I want to invite us, as you could see, our conversation for today is around what does one use Jesus to do? What does one use Jesus to do? And so, to that end, I want to start just with this image, with this presentation. Then I'm going to jump into another graphic that I have. So, what does one use Jesus to do? If I asked you to think about what Jesus looks like, many would come with this image from Warner Salmon from 1940. You say, if talking about Jesus, this is who we're talking about. But for those who have been seminary trained and who know better and who recognize that Jesus was um, was crucified in Judea, would recognize that this type of figure would is not Jesus, nor what Jesus would look like. So what does Jesus look like? Or who is this Jesus that we're talking about? Well, for many in the US, this Jesus, capitalist corporate Jesus, would seem to fit into their paradigm for who Jesus is or what Jesus does. Although this is laughable in many current and contemporary conversations, this is very much how people understand how Jesus moves. But if we move away from this kind of hyperbolic mischaracterization, even though the artist probably considered this to be accurate, we still would want to say let's get to something a little bit more accurate, something that captures in a better way what Jesus or who Jesus was, which tells us about who Jesus is. We go to this, my favorite. I have this a portrait of Jesus the Liberator in my office. And so is this Jesus? And this is the Jesus that I have. This is the Jesus that as I said, have the icon in my office. But this is also not a historically accurate image of Jesus. It is a portrait that's doing work. Every image of Jesus is doing work. But it does the kind of work I need it to do, especially thinking with Black liberation theology and abolitionist hermeneutics, that this image, this portrait of Jesus, is useful for me. Now, some, when trying to think about what a historical Jesus would look like, we'll go to this image from the 2001 created image from this forensic anthropologist, Richard Neve, who said this is potentially what a Galilean man would have looked like in the first century CE. But friends, this is not even the oldest image or way that Jesus is portrayed or described, even though some would say this is more historical. What we actually have, the oldest depiction we have of Jesus to us is a text. And here is here is an excerpt from Codex Sinaiticus, the oldest surviving manuscript New Testament text. And here it's the Gospel of Mark, Kata Markon. And what's underlined is the nomina sacra, the sacred name, Jesu Christu, Jesus Christ, or Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the Anointed One. And so the oldest image we have of Jesus is not a picture, it's a word. The oldest image we have of Jesus is not a portrait, it's not a figure, it's a word and its words. And even by the time we get to the Gospel of Mark, which is written around 70 CE, Jesus has been executed and crucified by the Roman Empire, and the movement has begun for almost 40 years by this point. And so even by the time we get this image or this text as a portrayal of who Jesus is, it's already at least a generation later than Jesus's life. And so I raise this because, especially from biblical studies perspective, that when we move from just these words that we have, even when we start to turn them into images, when we start to build faith and systems around them, it's the interpreter who is doing the work to saturate this word with meaning. Because even when we try to do a historical portrayal or portrait, that is the interpreter filling this word with meaning. And so, part of what I invite students to think about, and part of what I'm inviting us to think about today, is what are we filling the word Jesus with? And what do we use Jesus to do? That is the big question that is a part of my pedagogy for especially Intro New Testament. What are people using Jesus to do? And so what I have for us is a graphic that I like to use to just show how there are 14 major moments across Christian history, I say, where we can see how Jesus has been transformed and used in a variety of ways. And so the reason why this fits in with our conversation around decolonizing Christianity is it's important for us to pay attention to what people have historically used Jesus to do and what they are using Jesus to do now, and how that plays into what people who are faithful or who want to follow Jesus in a way that is resistant colonization. We have to be able to clearly assess what it is that we are decolonizing, and how deep that colonizing project has already been done and goes. And so here's just a timeline so we can see some of these major moments of Christian history that get us to where we are, to how many are using Jesus, and hopefully provide some opportunities for us to critique, to resist, and to rethink what and how we're using Jesus. So we'll start at the beginning. In 30 CE, thereabout, we have the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth in Judea under the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. From a historical perspective, this is the only historical thing that we can actually say about Jesus, that Jesus was executed by the Romans in Judea in the first century under Pontius Pilate. And after this, what we find are people, Jesus followers, or some call early Christians, making sense of the murder of the Messiah and making sense of what happened and why Jesus is executed. The earliest interpreters that we have around trying to make sense of the work of Jesus and how the Messiah was executed, we have Paul the messenger, Paul the apostle, and he's already taking the story of Jesus who's executed by the Romans, and he's seeing Jesus as not just a teacher. He doesn't speak much about his teachings, but instead, Paul understands Jesus as a Jewish body that becomes a homing device, an opportunity for non-Judeans, heathens, the way to translate ethne or Gentiles, for them to understand how to be in relationship with the God of Judea. And so Paul is already starting to fill up what Jesus is being used to do. And Paul does this work before we get the gospel accounts. We don't receive the gospel accounts. The earliest canonical gospel is the Gospel of Mark, which we get in 70 CE. And here the gospel writers are crafting Jesus to tell stories that are meaningful for their communities and stories that will help them to make sense of the contemporary environment that they're living in, because the temple has been destroyed in Jerusalem by the Romans, and now Jesus is helping them to understand how to connect with the God of Judea and how they are to engage with each other and other Jewish or Judean people. By the time we get to the early 100s into the 200s, we start to see Jesus be not just seen as a character in the Gospels or as Paul's theological project, but we start to see Christianity spread across the Mediterranean. This is about when we start to see people actually use the term Christian positively to talk about themselves. And but even here, it's there's separate ways of thinking about it. We can think about the pastoral epistles. They're starting to think about Jesus not just as a human, as a figure, but Jesus as the founder of their community, as a founder of a tradition, as they're taking in the second and third generations of the Jesus following movement. They're working with this, and they have disparate accounts. That's why there's multiple gospels. There's multiple ways that Paul writes to these communities. Even within the New Testament, we'll see in Peter saying that some things from Paul are hard to understand. So there's a lot of conversations about what are we going to use Jesus to do? What is the appropriate way to use Jesus? Is Matthew's community the right one? Luke's community the right one? John's community? Paul, Peter? We see in First Corinthians, right, that there's even as early as the 40s and 50s, they're trying to decide who is the correct holder of the Jesus tradition. Is it Chloe's people? Is it Paul? Is it Apollo? Is it Peter? All this is a part of the early Christianities. It's not really until we get to the fourth century and the Council of Nicaea that we have what could be defined an Orthodox Christianity, where Jesus gets confirmed as God the Son, a part of the Trinity. The Trinity, as an idea and concept, doesn't come around until the second century with Tertullian, and it gets reified here at the Council of Nicaea. And Constantine uses Christianity as a tool for strengthening and bringing the Roman Empire together. It's only really at this point that we can talk about the Christianity. Prior to this, there's various Christianities, and even with this Roman and imperial inflected Christianity, there are still others like Arians and those who would be considered heretics who have different perspectives. But what's most important for this conversation is that it's this moment when Orthodox Christianity has its origin point, and it's because it's gotten in bed with the Roman Empire. Right. And so here, Jesus is being used for the empire. And Constantine uses the cross in a way that even Paul doesn't use it, because something that I want as a little side project, rabbit hole to send you on, is that Paul doesn't use the word cross in the book of Romans. Like which is like he. I know that Williams is crazy now because that can't be true. But go look into it. But cross and empire become intertwined by the fourth century in thinking about who Jesus is and what Jesus does. A moment and a couple of moments that really get left out often in Christian history are these moments in late antiquity that go into the Middle Ages. One of the features that really is important for how the Christianities that are practiced in the West, in the United States in particular, they are in response to this number six here, to the rise of Islam. Because in 638 CE, Muslims, they take over and reside in Jerusalem from 638 to 1099. Right. This so for 460 plus years, right, this Christianity that kind of comes from Constantine forward is trying to define and understand itself up and against Islam that also has an understanding of Jesus that's different. And this is important because in this same period in the 11th century, right, the Crusades, schism, and the idea of satisfaction, atonement that comes from Anselm are all wrapped into this moment when Western Christianity, which is the branch that we are coming off of, is really defining itself up and against Islam. So in this moment, Jesus is being understood as a European ancestor, right? That Jesus becomes the basis for satisfaction, and Jesus is seen as the leader of crusades. Now this could seem this is a misuse for many to think of Jesus, but this is the cauldron, this is the moment, the historical situation out of which the Christianity that moves to the West comes, where Jesus, who before was from Nazareth and executed, who is a gospel character story, and then becomes a tool for Constantine's empire, is now becoming a figure, an ancestor for European identity. And it just so happens that Jesus, the understanding of atonement, where Jesus satisfies a debt and an honor debt that people could not pay back, becomes a theological idea. That idea didn't exist prior to this 11th century moment. And it's in this same period of time that as Western European Christianity is developing, that they are building their idea and understanding how Jesus works for them up and against Islam, which then is particularly important because Islam had reached all the way up into Europe and had pretty much conquered Spain. And it wasn't until 1491 that Spanish Christians had reconquered Spain. And then it's not a coincidence that the next year that Columbus, inspired by this kind of Islamophobic Jesus as a European ancestor rhetoric, begins what Yale scholar Alan McHale calls a Christian or Catholic jihad against people who he considered to be Muslims or Islamic. Part of what I want us to note is that a lot of Western Christianity's idea of Jesus is really founded in ideas of Islamophobia, othering others. So much so that when Columbus came to the Americas, he saw the indigenous people and thought they were Muslim because part of his religious world imagination was that Jesus was a part of his European tradition. And so if people were different or other, then they had to be a part of these infidel Muslims from Columbus's perspective. And so in from this vantage point, we see that Jesus becomes a part of the colonizing project, so much so that in 1563, Jesus is the name of a colonizer's ship, right? And so Jesus becomes a tool for civilizing in Spain and in the Spanish Americas, right? All those places that speak Spanish, not because that's their natural language, but because the Spanish, like English, like Portuguese, is a colonizer's language. And so then, while this is happening, 25 years later, often the story of the Protestant Reformation gets told in a different register, but the Protestant Reformations are happening in the age of colonization. And so Jesus, we already talked about, was a satisfactory idea where like Anselm understood this salvation notion as humans were they were vassals. God was a Lord whose honor had been offended, and in order for them to pay back this debt, Jesus had to pay a debt he didn't owe, for a debt he didn't pay. That idea comes down in some contemporary Christian theologies. But then by the time we get to 1517, when we have, Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses to the door, that that Jesus then gets transformed again, these Protestant Reformations conversations, to this idea of substitutionary atonement, where people are made justified because of what Jesus did, sola fide, sola scriptura. And so this idea again, I'm kind of pointing out how these ideas and using Jesus in these ways are happening in historical moments. They are not something that go all the way back to 30 CE or in time immemorial, but they are particular moments in history when Jesus is being rethought and reconsidered and used for particular historical projects, particularly colonizing projects. And so then when we get to this image in the 17th century and 18th century, you have thinkers like Immanuel Kant who engaged Jesus as secular, as an exemplar, an exemplary of Western European human, right? That this idea of Jesus as the best human being, as one who is outside of just church doctrines, but one who is able to help usher in this age of reason and the ideas of liberty, or those that kind of mark the both the French Revolution, which trickles into the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jesus as a champion of these types of ideas is happening as Western Europeans are moving through the Enlightenment and thinking about how does Jesus relate to this project and relate to the church. And at the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century, as the Great Awakening is rising, Jesus is transformed again using a different way. Jesus understood as personally saving people, both amongst the enslaved and enslavers. And this is all happening at the precipice of the Civil War, as people, especially in the United States, are trying to think through what to do with enslaved people and how that fits with their faith. That there are moments when they considered that enslaved people couldn't even be saved because they didn't have souls. But the Second Great Awakening helps to shift that. But what its emphasis on is not just on salvation, but on the idea that this personal salvation can have something spiritual for somebody, but may not have anything to do with their political or material experience. And and so in the Civil War, this is a useful moment to think about because both sides were thinking about Jesus, thinking about God. Abraham Lincoln would talk about we're using the same Bible, but had come to different conclusions, and especially about what Jesus meant, how Jesus related to people. And so this moment is one that trickles into this time. And hopefully what you can see is that all of these previous historical moments in some way keep trickling down into the conglomerate Jesus that many of us didn't even recognize was a conglomerate of all of these historical moments. So then after the US Civil War, you start to see ideas that arise both in the United States, but particularly in Europe, where Jesus is understood again, similar to the earlier idea of being a European ancestor, but particularly Jesus is Aryan. Um, You see ideas from people like Marx, where Jesus is seen as the opiate of the people. But something also worth noting in this time that it was a small thread that had been breaking out while like Africans were enslaved in the United States, is another vision of Jesus, a Jesus who is committed to social justice. Now, I really want to highlight that in many ways, right, the idea of Jesus being connected to justice movements is not the dominant way that Jesus had been used in Western Christianity, right? This is something that is a part of a historical moment that is happening really in the early 20th century, and not just around the civil rights movement, but we see the rise of the social gospel as well. People saying, "Oh, this Jesus stuff means that we should actually be trying to make the kingdom of heaven on earth as it is in heaven." Right. That becomes a part of this Western tradition later, right? It's not a part from these earlier moments. And then by number 13 here, and I'm running out of time. I'm probably out of time. But that during the Cold War, the Cultural Revolution, and the rise of the far right, Jesus is transformed again into an American anti-communist conservative man, right? If you look at that image of capitalist Jesus shaking hands that I showed you from before, and the way that Jesus gets talked about up into up especially in these moments in the 50s when we put in God we trust on our currency, that Jesus is not just white or European. Jesus is American, right? And anti-communist and conservative. And I broke this apart to around the 90s to move into 2001. As many of us know, that was after 9/11. Particularly, it's a particular moment when Jesus is being used, and even very recently, and we can just check the headlines and see some of our colleagues in ministry who are using Jesus in this way now, especially as the war in Iran is waging, that Jesus is not just all the way back to this Palestinian who was executed in Nazareth, but Jesus has now become a patriot and a patron of neoliberal capitalism and its wars. If you A quick note, and then I'm ready for us to take questions. Recently, Pope Leo XIV said that God doesn't hear the prayers of those who are dropping bombs on innocent people. And we turn around, and the White House press secretary says, well, from our Judean Christian values, we have we have had people praying and being prayed for as they've been killing people, and we don't think it's inappropriate. Why? Because Jesus is a patriot. Jesus is a patron for them of neoliberal capitalism and its wars. And so I wanted us just to see how, when we think about decolonizing Christianity, it's important for us to think about how Jesus has been used by Christians and Christianity in all of these variety of ways. And in order to decolonize Christianity, then we have to be very intentional about what we're using Jesus to do. I know in some spaces we tell people just preach Jesus, but the question that I want us to think about is, which Jesus are you preaching? And what are you using Jesus to do in that preaching, in that teaching, in that way you live and organize your life? Thank you for this time, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much. We have got some folks in the chat that want your timeline and want to know if we can get that timeline from you and to be shared. But I know there's probably some questions. I see some applauses for your presentation, Dr. Williams, and I see a hand raised already. So we'll just get into the
Yes.
conversation. Hakiki Thompson, I saw. Reverend Thompson, are you there?
I am. Can you not hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay. How do you see Jesus being reframed in the last 8 to 12 years in our Western Christianity?
Um, one of the ways that is as alarming is that part of that last frame is that Jesus is being evoked to wage war, and particularly in that 2001 moment where Islamophobia becomes that same Islamophobia from back in the 11th century that's still kind of under some of these drumbeats of Christianity shows back up, and we see it even recently with this Iran war where there were military commanders who were telling their troops that they were going to start the Battle of Armageddon, which for me is a very much a misread of Revelation. But very directly, the Secretary of War, which I say unironically for the Department of War, like is literally has tattoos of the Crusade shield on his body. And so, for in the higher echelons of American imperial power, we have people using Jesus to justify killing brown people and seeing Islam as a perpetual threat and enemy. So that's one way. Now, my more hopeful and my more abolitionist lens is that, and I have to say this has really given me encouragement from my who I follow on social media and Instagram, that there are folks who are really seeking to live out and elevate the what they consider as a liberating love ethic of Jesus. And I do think that there is a lot of conversation around people who are thinking about what it means to see Jesus as one who resists domination, exploitation, and violence impacting lives. I think that is rising. But I also think that the dominant narrative that Jesus is a patron of American power is a very, very difficult stream that's coming down on us that we have to push up against. Um, so I think that we're in the minority position for those of us who don't want to see Jesus supporting empire. But I don't think that we're alone, and I don't think that being in the minority means that you should give up or that you're not right. I think that's what the prophetic tradition is always about, being the minority and telling the truth and saying that there is another way, even if most people think that this is the way that we should be going.
I see two hands in and there's a question in the chat. I'll go with the hands. Reverend Chris Shade and then Demetrius Williams.
Uh, I can go first, if that's okay. I
Yeah,
was I saw a lot of parallels on your timeline between um, the dominant images of Jesus and also the um, sort of the narrative that was put forth by the ruling powers, I guess, or the dominant powers. And I'm curious if there have been other in those, particularly towards the last, since the Renaissance and the last sort of 400 or 500 years, if there have been images of Jesus um, that were not developed or not associated with the ruling class that have risen up.
yeah. Thank you, Reverend Shade. Uh, my one of my big theses that I wasn't really able to get into here is I think that every time there is a dominating or oppressive image of Jesus or any powerful ideology, that there are people who are resisting that there are people who are seeking a more liberative way. There are people who are thinking about Jesus differently. And so I think in each of these moments, like when I was talking briefly about the 50s and the 60s, that we definitely see that the civil rights movement are and others are putting forward a different vision for who Jesus can be. Um, we see even like I mentioned, this current moment where there are people who are talking about Jesus is not as exclusive as these more conservative traditions want to portray Jesus. But part of what I'm getting at here is that um, the the mainstream hegemonic images are in support of power. And so part of us thinking about decolonizing the Christianity is to do kind of the the underground work of what I'm doing, a people's history versus kind of the what I've given is the history of the hegemony, but a people's history would always see this resistance, like with the Christian social gospel movement. That was a current that was pushing a different direction. When we think about um, historically where there were challenges to even go back in the fourth century to whether or not the version of Christianity endorsed by the Roman Empire was the only one. The Arians can be understood as a protest movement to this empire inflected Christianity. So there's always some resistance, but part of the work of the hegemonic narrative is to brand those resistance movements as heresy, as unorthodox, as unacceptable. And so, in some ways, I'm inviting people to be heretics to this type of Jesus following, this type of Christianity.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Good afternoon.
Dr.
Excellent presentation.
Williams,
How you doing, sir?
good to see you.
Good to be seen. Excellent presentation. And first of all, a challenge. I hope this is a book project
Mm,
because the various portrayals of Jesus, it sort of verifies Albert Schweitzer's contention that all in the life of Jesus research, everybody created a Jesus in his own image. But
hmm
my question is problematizing the notion of Christocentrism. You hear
mm,
people I mean, in journals and books and testimonies, people say, "Oh, I'm Christ-centered." But the question is, what is the Christ of your chosen perspective? And so I think that is the challenge because I was at a conference and the person was saying, yeah, we need to be Christocentric. And I raised my hand, but which Christ are we to center on? And you
hmm
demonstrated that this is not just a problem in a biblical text because I've been working on this topic, looking at it within the realm of the New Testament. Paul is Christos Stavros because he concentrates on the cross. His competitors are Christonomos because they see Jesus through the law, or even in Second Corinthians, they are Christobios because they see Jesus' life as a man of power. So, how would you problematize for us the whole notion of being Christ-centered or Christocentric, given your presentation?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I do want to at some point maybe we could talk offline with the Crystal Staros and see what you thought about my statement about the cross not being in Romans and think about and say a little bit more about that. But what I really want to take. Oh, you want to say something?
Yeah, when you said that, it reminded me of my dissertation, which was on enemies of the cross of Christ. It is only mentioned once in Romans 6:6, not the cross. You're
The
right,
crucifixion.
stavros, but sustavrao, to be crucified with Christ. So
Yeah.
you are correct, but he doesn't elaborate on the cross as such in Romans. That's all I'll say for now. We can talk,
Oh yeah, yeah. I'd love to have more of this conversation.
and now you know why my publication to you is late.
And in line with what Dr. Williams raised, one thing that I talk about in my, I try to introduce students to in my Intro New Testament class is that there's not one Jesus in the New Testament. I say that they're Jesoi. That's the Greek plural of Jesus. But each of the gospel writers is portraying Jesus in a different way for their own project. We see Paul has a Jesus, and then people will say, well, in the Old Testament, this is the language. They don't say Hebrew Bible. In the Old Testament, God is a God of wrath. But in the New Testament, Jesus preaching peace. And I said, but what about the apocalypse? What about Revelation? Jesus in Revelation comes off at the beginning as a lamb, but then by the end of the book, killing people with a sword in his mouth, right? So even in the New Testament, there is not one image of who Jesus is. And so the question of which Jesus are we talking about and what are we using Jesus to do is really central for hermeneutics and our interpretive projects. Um, I know you understand this, Dr. Williams, but for the rest of the group, this question of who Jesus is often comes to many of us in prepackaged ways. And so part of what I wanted to highlight with this timeline is that different people receive different packages. And at different moments, the package looks different. And if you don't interrogate the package, you might think that you're talking about that brown-skinned Palestinian conceived an unwed teenage mother and executed by Pontius Pilate. But you might be talking about patriot, warmongering Jesus, right? If you don't interrogate it, if you don't interrogate and ask the question. So in many ways, the answer to the question is what you already raised in the question is first recognizing that there are multiple Jesuses that we draw from and that speak to us in different moments. And what I will note is that I could definitely do this timeline in a different way. I could do a kind of thinking about Michel Foucault, the French philosopher. If I want to do a genealogy of the Christian mystical traditions that have resisted empires, that would have been a different type of project. But particularly in this conversation about decolonizing Christianity, I wanted to highlight the ways that the empire has found Jesus as a ready-made symbol to use for its projects. And we have to be careful.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. I have a question, and I see a hand raised, but I have a question in the chat that I want to, and there's some other questions, but this question is a little more conversation on Islam, please. I have several Islamic friends who very much believe Jesus to be a prophet. Could you talk a little bit more of the thought process of Christianity that led to Islamophobia, where there could have been a conversation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And part of what really led to this timeline was I read this book that I assigned my students in one of my courses recently, Blood, A Critique of Christianity by Gil Anidjar. It's a dense book. So if you're interested, I can tell you the pages to read rather than try to work your way out because it's really dense. But part of what he raises in why I brought up that 11th century moment is that the Western Christianity that is really at the 11th century becomes will be Western Catholicism. After the papal Reformation, and not to get too far into these details, Western European Catholic Christians, which is really kind of the identity that's being developed, they understand themselves up and against the Islamic empires, especially because at this point, Islam and Muslims had control of Jerusalem. And this is a part of world history that often people talk about the Dark Ages. It's the Dark Ages because Muslims were in control, right? That it's a part of a Western way of telling the story. Similarly, and it's not until 1491 that Christians, Western European Christians, take over Spain again, right? So Muslims had been ruling Spain. And so part of like what is really at stake in these conversations is it's less really even about kind of the faith or belief systems because as noted in the question, understanding Jesus as a prophet, and the high regard that the Islamic faith holds Jesus and Mary is a part of how Christianity, Judaism, Islam were all baking together in the East, learning from each other, part of similar conversations about how to understand God, like that these are happening simultaneously. But part of what I'm particularly highlighting here are the ways that colonial power infused with Western Christianity saw Islamic imperial power as a threat to its identity. And the parallel today are the ways that U.S. Americans talk about the Ayatollah and the Sunni Islam in Iran to use it not just to talk about a religious difference, but as a political military difference, and then to index that to faith. Because part of what gets to become a part of the conversation is that all of the people of this faith, when it becomes political, they're terrorists. When really, the reason why I like how Alan McKell talks about Columbus's work to say that he was a Catholic jihadist or a Christian jihadist, that like the colonization project was a terrorism project, right? If understood from those who were already there who were being invaded. And so shifting the perspective allows us to see, and coming at it from this kind of political range helps us to understand that people's different identities get weaponized in multiple ways, and particularly around how do we get to the other side of this. What's worthwhile thinking is part of what I believe that you're getting at. Having friends in other traditions, you realize that these dominant narratives, right? These dominant narratives are actually not true. Like having spent time in Morocco and other places, to just think about these people are trying to love their families, love their God, take care of them, and hoping that things work well. The God will, inshallah. That there's a lot more in common with us people who are not in the helms of power, who have access to weapons to bomb and destroy each other. We have way more in common with what we're trying to make life out to be than those who are leveraging our children to harm others. The people don't really even have an issue with us. These are governments and old men using everybody else and the resource at their disposal to wreak havoc on mass scales. And so I think that the kind of dialogue that you're having, being able to talk with people with different faiths, especially in Islamic faith, it helps to say that it helps to disparage some of the Islamophobia that is just a part of being American, that is just a part of being a Westerner. The conversation, even in France, around whether people can wear a hijab in public or not. It like the West has this Islamophobic impulse that has to continually to be resisted. Um, because I mean, how bad can people be who have to pray 5 times a day? Like way more faithful than most Christians I know. Right. I mean, and right, we know that Muslim just means to submit to Allah, and Allah is just the name for God. But what is it that makes these separations? It's these political colonial machinations that transform the other into this heathen terrorist and doing it in Jesus' name. That's the part that really irks me the most. Like doing it in Jesus' name. You do it in your own name. Do it in the name of your country. Don't do it and say God bless it.
Thank you. We have Ja Ing. She's got her hand raised.
Uh,
No.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the historical study and the presentation about the Christianity. I'm a student and Old Testament student, but I'm interested one thing, yeah, that is for me, Jesus is a kind of colonizer. Yeah, he
Mm,
colonized, but his colonization is quite great, yeah, right? That's one
mm.
thing. And then nowadays, briefly, yes, nowadays I saw that a lot of people, I have seen that a lot of people are using Jesus as a business in their business, in their trading or something. They are using Jesus as a goods. So according up to your presentation and then your question answer, and then my question is, okay, this is quite serious, and so where or how we can find the real Jesus during this day? How and where can we find Jesus, real Jesus? Thank you, sir.
My answer is going to be disappointing, but hopefully, if you stick with me for a little bit, it'll make sense. I'm not sure if there's a the real Jesus to get to, because part of what I want us to think about is that there are multiple Jesuses, And we have to choose and construct and work with one. And that's really what theological project is, the Jesus, to me, that leads to justice, love, and wholeness. Um, but but am I going to be able to just find this Jesus sitting out in history, just pick him out and say, this is him? I, as an interpreter, I, as a Jesus follower, I, as a contemporary Christian, I am a part of this dance of not creating Jesus. I don't want to be that heretical and sacrilegious, but of using the resource at my disposal to find a Jesus that aligns with a hermeneutic that leads toward justice, that leads toward love, that leads toward wholeness, that resists domination, that resists exploitation, that resists violence. For me, I think that Luke 4 around verse 18 is the way to think about a Jesus who sets captives free, who opens the eyes of people who've been blinded, who proclaims God's freedom and liberation. Like, to me, that is important for who Jesus is. But Matthew didn't see that as important to put in his gospel. Mark didn't put it in his, right? But I like that version. I lean into to that, and so part of it is for us to put together the Jesus to, and for me, the Jesus that's worthwhile is one that's going to set people free.
Thank you. We've got another question. I see some more hands raised. We've got a question in the chat that I also want to address. Um, I am currently reading Saving Paradise, How
Mm.
Christianity Traded Love of This World for Crucifixion. So timeline was a very helpful reminder. In the book, they talk about early Christians trying to create paradise on earth. I'm wondering if there is something we could tap into that, or are there also issues in their theology? I have not finished the book, so I have not seen what the authors will say yet. Is there an issue around the theology of Christians trying to create paradise on earth?
Yeah, I'm ambivalent on this, as you probably all are learning about me. I'm ambivalent about a lot of things, but the ambivalence is not because I don't think that our work should not be trying to create a place of radical egalitarian community accountability, restoration, and equity. I don't. I think we should be trying to do that, but we're going to fail at it. But our goal should be trying to get there. But often our best goals are not. So should we try? I definitely think we should. But should we also keep a critical eye toward when people have tried to do this? Christopher Columbus in his diary said that when he had come to Hispaniola, that he was in the New Jerusalem, and he was like John the Revelator. So so he thought that he was creating a paradise. And so there are ways, but then there are other communities, right? We see them historically with the monastics who went away and said, we're going to separate from society and create a space where we can just worship. We see it with I mean, in religious practices, enslaved people in hush harbors, stealing away to worship in spite of the larger hegemonic systems. So we see people trying to create little paradises away, but the work is always to say, how do we keep on moving toward that, and in which ways are we? Have we been already contaminated with empire and colonization that we have to keep on kind of exercising out of ourselves?
Thank you. We've got two more hands in the group, and there's some more questions in the chat. So just want to, honor your time and see, if you want to take some more questions or where are you, Dr. Williams?
Yeah, I can take the two hands,
Okay, all right.
and then people feel free to email me since we ran out of time too, or we can take these questions and email them, and I can send some responses that way too.
Okay, all right. We're going to go to Eden.
Hello. My question is around specifically now there are Turning Point club chapters in high schools and schools across our nation. And for me, surprisingly, there are more and more young Black people, people of color, who are now ascribing to the Jesus of the empire as a result of being parts of these clubs and being parts of the indoctrination that happens there. You kind of talked about things we can do within our families. We have the opportunity to influence children. But with the removal of teaching critical thinking in schools, what do you see as opportunities for churches to be able to counteract or cause some friction, that work of deconstruction, particularly for
Um, I think if I could, the last part of your question fell off, but I can, but I think the gist of it is around what can we do in our churches to help young people and others to think critically in these moments.
correct about deconstructing, constantly having to deconstruct because that's not particularly what they're being exposed to. And there aren't a whole lot of Christians who are deconstructing at this time, right? They're working through that as well. So, what are some things our churches can do to be able to support um, our children in a way that is going to cause friction
Yeah.
and questioning?
Thank you for this question.
Mhm.
There's a couple of things that I would say. The first, kind of being a teacher, is really closely examine our like Sunday school and vacation Bible school curriculum, because in many ways the curriculum we're getting is reinforcing some of these colonizing ideas. And so, thinking about urban ministries and others that are already doing the work to think through this and to provide like curricula for young people and people in the congregation. That's one strategy. Another, and this is really not pedestrian, I think it's really important, is to like find social media accounts, whether YouTube or Instagram or TikTok, where people are doing this kind of work. Like people like Christian Smith, who like short videos that are giving alternative perspectives,
Mhm.
and people are already on their phones and on their devices anyway. So how do we not just try to get them to come to us to learn things, but say, here's a video, and to think about, as we are all are having to rethink what ecclesiology and church is, to really think about that as evangelism or teaching opportunities to say, here's a video I saw, check this out, and then let's mess up your algorithm a little bit, right? Let's not have all of this turning point stuff, but let's give some examples from like Reverend Geraldine, who is another one, or a variety of Christian thinkers. I mean, preachers like Otis Moss III, like his Trinity has a really good social media platform where they are putting out clips of the sermons. He does this piece of 5 minutes where he explains different parts of what's happening. Like social media, I think we can use it. We don't have to necessarily see it as a problem, but like really as a useful educational resource. And so those are two things I would offer really quickly as ways that I think that we can really be making some difference. I know sometimes we feel like we have to generate all the content and the material. But one of the gifts of the social media moment is that there are a lot of people who are doing this work. And so just to find the folks and to say, and maybe even kind of, what I've done, I work with the CMEs, my denomination with our Leadership Training Institute, and I try to put stuff on our YouTube page that when people want some resources, they can just go to the YouTube and find some videos. So it's not a full answer, but I think that's some of the ways to start these kind of conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have Vanessa Ewing.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I was kind of grappling with, I agree, you introduced the idea that there are many different ways that we can understand Jesus, and that each of us, I think just being a human person, we each have our own understanding of him. And I very much have come across that as well, and I agree with that kind of understanding. And you also spoke about how someone asked the question, which was something I was thinking about, like how can we figure out what is the true Jesus? And honestly, for what you said, like I don't think that necessarily exists just in our own human understanding, just because we have this limited understanding. We can't have the infinite understanding of God. But how can we reconcile with maybe somebody who doesn't view Jesus in the way that we view Jesus? And how can we discern, are they viewing Jesus in just a way that I haven't thought about him? Or is it like a false prophet, a false teaching that has infiltrated their mind? Kind of reckoning with that reconciliation. And I think, like, from my own self, obviously we can go to God and we can ask for the Holy Spirit's guidance with that discernment. And also for me, like, trying to figure out how where the basis of Jesus lies is always in what he says is the most important commandments, to love God with all of your being and to love your neighbor as yourself. So, like, going back to these as the greatest commandments, that everything is based on that. And obviously also Paul says, like, it doesn't matter who your teacher is. And we get these we get taught in, like you said, the kind of finite packages and in this way of viewing Jesus in a certain way, but that's a finite thing, and Jesus and God are infinite and so much bigger than what we can understand. So yeah, I guess, but how can we, yeah, that question of reconciliation with somebody and discernment in that.
Yeah. A couple quick things I would say is we should always practice what I call epistemological humility, meaning that as you noted well, we don't know everything. And so when we are approaching people, sometimes the hardest part is that the people who are really adamant know that they know what they know, but actually don't know. And it's hard to convince them they don't know. And so first recognizing that we are asking questions. And one of my colleagues likes to talk about this text called that Jesus is the question rather than Jesus the answer. Um, and I think that that's important for us to remember that part of our work is not to be teachers. I mean, I'm gonna go Bible, so I'm gonna be a pastor, not a Bible scholar, but that Jesus calls his disciples. He calls them disciples, not teachers, not didascaloi, not teachers. He calls them students. And we're invited to be students. We're invited to always be learning, to be expanding our thoughts about who God is and who Jesus is. And so that orientation, it already is a decolonizing project because colonization says, I have the answer, and if you don't accept my answer, then I will punish you. The alternative to that is not to say, well, take my answer instead. The alternative to that is, how about we learn together? Because there's something I can learn from you, and I know I have something I can offer you as well. And we both can grow together rather than you have to do and follow me. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you for that response. Yeah, thank you. That.
Thank you. All right, sir. We've got one more question I'm going to take from the chat, and then
Then I got to get
we'll,
some lunch.
yeah, we'll close out so you can eat and folks can go on about their day. Just one more. Did the phenomenology of Jesus play a large role in the early colonization of Christianity?
Mm. And by phenomenology,
Physical appearance and interpretation of physical appearance.
aha, I would say that it's interesting use of phenomenology there because when I think of phenomenology, I think about how the idea is used in a community and evaluating how that community is experiencing it. And so since that's the case, and so I bracket and suspend mine. I really do think that Jesus was very much a part, the image, the cross were very much a part of how colonization presented an alternative truth or reality that was available to people, and people could lean and look into it in the same way that we, as you noted in the question, that there are ways that people are cleaving and clinging to certain images of the divine in order to support their own projects. Speaking about the turning point, and Erica Kirk talking about that you have to protect white men, and you can kind of hear in the back because Jesus is a white man, of course, right? Like there's these parallel discourses, like that image, that Salmon image I showed, that's in a lot of people's houses, including minoritized people's houses, right? That understand the divine in this way. It is not insignificant that people think of Jesus, a Palestinian executed in Judea, right, who probably spoke Aramaic, whose only like recording or copied words are in Greek. It's not unintentional that people portray him as a white man, right? There has to be a lot of historical ignoring, not ignorance, ignoring to make that happen.
Mhm.
Right. And
Yeah.
I think that that's a part of this feminine because then people don't only just connect to the message of Jesus, which we might agree with, but the image of Jesus that's presented to them and their distance from that image also becomes a part of the theological project. So
Thank
thank
you
you for that
so
question.
much. Dr. Williams, thank you so much. We're going to have to wrap
Thank you.
up, but we have the questions. Can we put your email in the so folks can, if they still have questions, they can contact you? What would be the best email for folks
Here we
to
go.
use?
I'm putting in the chat. I'll do my
Okay.
Gmail one. Yeah.
All right. So, folks, if you still have questions, have a conversation with Dr. Jeremy Williams of Bright Divinity School. He has put his email in the chat, and we are just grateful for your time with us today. Yeah, I see the hearts and the applause. Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. And he is the first leg. Can you imagine? He's just setting the scene for what is to come. And so next month, we will have Dr. Miguel A. de la Torre. And June 3rd, we will have Reverend Ruben David Bonilla Ramos. And it's right there, the QR code. So register, sign up now. We've got some folks on the list and the lineup that you want to hear speak and engage in conversation. And those are just the first three. We've got some more coming. Also, our Center for Continuous Learning has this awesome session that you want to be a part of. It's called Texts of Horror and Healing. How should the church respond to domestic violence in light of Scripture? So you see that QR code, go ahead, get a picture of that QR code and register for this session. It's only $25. Text of Horror and Healing. What a great session and wealth of information that you will surely receive in that course. So please register today. We thank everyone for being with us on today, and we look so forward to you all being with us in the month of May. And during this Holy Week, we are praying with you, praying for our world, our communities, and that we are praying that as Good Friday leads us into the Resurrection Sunday, that we would remember to some of the words that Dr. Williams has even lifted up for us, to ask the question, who is the Jesus that we are calling on and that we believe and that we call Lord and Savior? And does that Jesus lead us to liberation, or does that Jesus lead us further into oppression under an empire? And so we are grateful for you, Dr. Williams. We're praying for you and your family and your ministry. And thank you all for being present. We will see you next month on May 6th, same time. And I don't know, it might be a different Zoom channel, but we'll but we'll get that out to you. God bless you all.